The fire in the longhouse flickers low, smoke curling into my eyes. I sit on the bench, my wrists raw from the coarse rope that binds them, the jeers of my kin echoing as they accuse me of weakness. Did you know Vikings sometimes measured a man's honour not by his sword, but by how long he endured in the bed, with sagas whispering of men lasting 3 hours or more? My wife trembles at the far end of the hall, not from cold, but from dread, for she knows tonight I must prove myself, and failure could cost us both our standing. This is Viking life, merciless, unflinching, absolute. Stay with me, and witness the truth behind it. The longhouse breathed like a living beast. Smoke curled from the central hearth, pressing into the rafters and rolling downward until it stung the eyes. Straw and wool mats lined the packed earth, each crowded with bodies wrapped in cloaks of fur and rough spun linen. The air was heavy, not only with the scent of pine resin and charred meat, but with the closeness of sweat, wool, and human nearness. Privacy was not a word known to the Viking household. Walls existed to keep out the cold, not to shield one from the gaze of kin and servant alike. A man and his wife shared a bedroll, shifting beneath the cover of a heavy cloak. Their movements, muffled but clear, stirred no outrage. Beside them, a child whimpered, soothed with a lullaby hummed through dry lips. Across the hall, an old thrall stacked firewood, his eyes averted, yet his ears sharp to every sound. Intimacy unfolded within this crowded theatre, and the community pretended to look away. Yet, in truth, nothing went unseen. The hearth was both protector and witness, its glow reflecting on faces half hidden in the smoke. What seemed to later ages unthinkable was to the Viking household survival itself. To live in such closeness was to endure the winters when snow locked the farmstead in silence and darkness. One man's breath warmed another. One woman's work of weaving, spinning, or nursing was performed beneath the gaze of all. To be known in such a place was to be laid bare, not in nudity alone, but in the endless scrutiny of neighbours and kin. The longhouse did not allow secrets, only silences. Songs from the sagas echo this truth. Lovers moved under blankets, and their muffled laughter or sudden sighs were absorbed by those who lay only an arm's length away. Such acts were rarely shamed, for the survival of kin demanded children, and children were born not from modest whispers, but from unions lived openly in crowded halls. Still, the etiquette of the room mattered. A careless moan too loud, a movement too brazen, could draw glances sharper than steel. Discretion was survival. To flaunt intimacy was to risk mockery, or worse, accusations of dishonour. The shared space created a world where boundaries blurred. A man might turn his back, but still hear his brother's hushed words to his bride. A woman might close her eyes, but still know the rhythm of another's union. This was the fabric of Viking life, interwoven, entangled, unavoidable. Even the smallest action carried consequence when performed under so many eyes. In this hall, the body was never truly one's own. It belonged to the family, to the farmstead, to the fragile order that kept hunger and shame at bay. A night of intimacy was not merely a joining of two, but an act within a web of kin, obligation, and reputation. Beneath the timbered roof, where smoke and whispers met, the Vikings lived exposed, unhidden, unshielded, and always remembered. In the sagas, men were not only measured by their strength in battle or the wealth of their farmsteads, they were judged, too, by how long they endured in the bed. Some tales spoke of warriors who returned from the shield wall and lay with their wives until dawn, their vigour likened to stallions or bulls, relentless and unyielding. To last 3 hours was not only boast, but expectation for those who sought to prove themselves in the eyes of kin and gods alike. Endurance in intimacy was not a private matter of passion, it was a test of honour. The longhouse knew when a man failed. A wife's sighs cut short, her whispers fading into silence, carried weight heavier than steel. She might not speak openly, but her disappointment could be read in the tilt of her gaze, in the way she shifted the next morning at the hearth. A woman's kin, visiting or residing within the household, could sense it as surely as they noticed a broken fence or a poorly slaughtered pig. Shame travelled fast in these halls, slipping between cloaks and whispered beside the fire. To falter too quickly was to invite mockery. Jests carried in feasts were not gentle, they cut to the bone. One man might raise a drinking horn and taunt his neighbour, hinting that his wife still turned restlessly at night. Such words were daggers of the tongue, sharper than any blade, for they struck not only the man but his entire lineage. The laughter of others could unravel his standing, just as surely as cowardice on the battlefield. The expectation of stamina was bound to survival. A strong bed performance meant fertility, and fertility meant heirs to till the soil, wield weapons, and carry a name into the next generation. For a family without sons, the line could wither like grain blighted in frost. Thus, a man's ability in the bed was tied not merely to pleasure, but to the future of his kin. Women, too, bore the weight of these expectations. To endure hours of union was to secure her place as a fertile vessel, to prove her capacity for motherhood. Failure, whether through silence, barrenness, or faint-hearted withdrawal, could cost her standing in the eyes of kin and gods. The sagas did not shy from such truths. They told of warriors mocked for weakness, women who prayed at shrines for husbands strong enough to cede them, and rivals who accused each other of failing their wives as readily as they accused them of theft or cowardice. Intimacy was a contest, not of passion but of reputation, and the contest was remembered. By the glow of the hearth, where smoke curled and shadows danced on timber beams, the knight's trials were known. Some endured, earning nods of respect in silence. Others faltered, their shame carried like a scar into the next feast, the next battle, the next verse sung by wandering poets. In the Viking world, even the bed was an arena, and every man who entered it fought for more than himself. He fought for honour, for lineage, and for survival. In the Viking world, words were never idle. A careless insult could wound more deeply than iron and provoke violence that lasted generations. Among the gravest of all accusations were those tied to sexuality. To be called weak in the bed, or worse, to be accused of taking the passive role in union, was to have one's very manhood stripped away. No sword blow could destroy a man as thoroughly as such words whispered in a hall filled with smoke and drink. The Norse called these deadly insults neath, words that branded a man unworthy of honour, a coward, or unmanly in ways no warrior could endure. To be accused of cowardice in battle was shame enough, but to be accused of being passive in bed was far worse. It meant not only that one's strength was doubted, but that one's place in society was broken. For a man who failed to dominate was no man at all, and in a culture where honour was armour, to be unmasked as dishonourable was a sentence harsher than death. These accusations were not made lightly, for they carried legal weight. Norse law codes preserved fragments that reveal their power. Certain sexual insults, so defamatory that they questioned a man's masculinity, granted him the legal right to kill the speaker on the spot. Such words, once uttered, could unleash holmgang, a duel fought on an island or marked ground, or spark blood feuds that spread like wildfire across kin groups. The insult was not only against the man himself, but against his family, his ancestors, and his descendants. It questioned the legitimacy of his children, the strength of his bloodline, and his right to stand as a free man. Women, too, were vulnerable to the venom of words. To be called promiscuous, unfaithful, or immodest could destroy her standing in an instant. A single whispered accusation could make her children's lineage suspect, ruin her prospects for alliances, and bring shame to her kin. Where men defended their honour with swords, Women often had to rely on their family's support or their own sharp tongues to resist the weight of gossip. But the stain of accusation was difficult to wash away, even when false. The sagas are filled with scenes where words were wielded as weapons. Feasts became battlegrounds of wit, where poets and warriors alike tested one another with veiled insults and cutting verses. A line of skaldic poetry could carry hidden meaning, its metaphor as sharp as any spear thrust. Those who failed to respond, or who responded poorly, could find themselves laughed into shame, their reputations collapsing with each mocking cheer. The longhouse was as dangerous as the battlefield, for there every gesture and every word was weighed. To mock a man's strength as a lover, to hint that he was used rather than using, was to risk the clash of steel before dawn. Reputation was life, and in a culture where the gods themselves judged by honour, words had the power to kill. Thus, the Viking tongue was never careless, for it could carve wounds that no healer could mend. The hearth was the heart of the Viking home, its fire a guardian against frost and darkness. Yet it was also an unblinking eye, for in the glow of its flames nothing remained hidden for long. The great timbered hall was not a place of solitude. Every act of living, eating, weaving, storytelling, sleeping, and coupling unfolded within its smoky walls. The hearth watched, and so did all who gathered around it. Marriage itself bore this weight of witness. When a man and woman were joined, their union was not sealed by words alone, but by the proof of consummation. It was not uncommon for kin, thralls, or servants to linger near the bed, listening for the signs that duty had been done. Sometimes the linens were inspected, sometimes silence was enough, but the knowledge of others was always present. The hearth fire glowed upon the couple, a silent recorder of vows fulfilled. What to later ages would seem shameful was to the Vikings practical necessity. A union unproven was a union untrusted, and trust was the coin of survival. Families staked their wealth and honour on the fertility of such bonds, and so they required certainty. A wife who bore children strengthened her husband's standing. A husband who fulfilled his role secured his family's future. The hearth bore witness, and the community remembered. Even beyond the marriage bed, intimacy rarely escaped the scrutiny of others. The longhouse was crowded, bodies lying side by side on benches and bed frames, cloaks pulled up against the cold. A man's hand beneath a blanket, a woman's whisper in the dark, such gestures did not pass unseen. Servants carried firewood at all hours. Children stirred in the night. Warriors returned late from the fields. Privacy was a fragile hope, often broken by the creak of a timber or the shift of straw. This watchfulness created a strange balance of tolerance and fear. Acts of closeness were expected, for without them no heirs would be born, and without heirs the clan would wither. Yet they were also carefully measured. Too much boldness risked gossip, too little passion risked mockery. The hearth offered warmth, but its flames also cast long shadows of judgment. The sagas hint at moments when this balance shattered. A woman accused of coldness might be mocked before all. A man suspected of weakness might be slandered at the feast. And once such words were spoken, they spread like sparks through dry thatch. The hearth that had borne witness became the fire that consumed reputations. Still, the hearth remained central. In its glow, lovers whispered. Wives bore children, families feasted, and laws were spoken. It was more than wood and flame, it was memory itself, recording every sound, every sigh, every oath. To live in a Viking longhouse was to live always beneath the gaze of the watchful hearth, where nothing stayed hidden and everything carried weight. In the corners of the longhouse, where the fire's glow faded into shadow, dwelled those whose presence was both accepted and resented, concubines. Often brought back from raids across Ireland, Francia, or the Baltic lands, they were woven into households, not as wives, but as possessions. They were captives, gifts or spoils, women taken by force or bargained as tribute. They warmed beds, bore children, and laboured by day, yet their place was precarious, half hidden, half visible, always uncertain. The free wife sat in authority, her keys rattling at her belt, keeper of the household's stores and honour. But in the shadows, the concubine might carry the same man's child, her womb a rival to the wife's. Such offspring, though born of the master's seed, entered the world with half rights, acknowledged by blood, but denied full inheritance unless publicly recognised. This precarious standing could ignite bitter feuds within the hall. Brothers divided by the mother's rank often turned to steel when they came of age, each staking claim to land, wealth, and honour. The sagas whisper of these tensions. A concubine could rise in favour, her beauty or bearing catching the chieftain's eye. A wife, though powerful, could not always keep her husband's gaze tethered. In some tales, the concubine's children outlived the wife's, becoming the only heirs left to carry a name. In others, their presence sparked jealous wrath, wives poisoning rivals, or households splitting apart in rage. The concubine lived under this constant shadow, desired but never secure, embraced but never honoured. Archaeology tells of women buried with foreign ornaments, beads from distant lands, or chains that marked their servitude. These may have been concubines women remembered neither as slaves nor as free. Their lives were liminal, stretched between survival and exploitation. Some bore children who grew to power, binding their bloodlines into the fabric of Scandinavia itself. Others vanished nameless, their stories swallowed by silence, their bones laid in graves without markers. For the Vikings, concubinage was not strange, it was survival, expansion, a natural consequence of raiding and conquest. A man who returned from battle might bring silver, cattle, or women. The silver could be melted, the cattle slaughtered, but the women lived on, reshaping households in ways that no coin could. Each breath they drew altered alliances, strained loyalties, and threatened the fragile peace between kin. In the smoky hall, concubines remained both seen and unseen. They tended the hearth, nursed infants, and endured whispers that cut like knives. Some carved out niches of quiet influence, wielding subtle power through the children they bore. Others endured in silence, shadows against the wall, their futures dictated by the shifting moods of the men who owned them. Thus, beneath the proud sagas of warriors and kings lay a quieter story, the story of concubines, whose bodies were currency, whose lives were bargaining chips, and whose very presence haunted the households they entered. Their shadows stretched long across the hearth, reminders of conquest and the cost of power. In the Viking world, desire was not only a private matter of flesh, but also a question of law. The same councils that judged theft, land disputes, and blood feuds also heard accusations tied to intimacy. At the Thing, where free men gathered beneath open sky to speak and decide, whispered charges of seduction, adultery, or unlawful unions could be brought forward. A man's honour and a woman's reputation were as much on trial as cattle or coin. Marriage was the cornerstone of alliances, binding families through dowry and bride price. To interfere with this structure was to risk not only scandal, but legal retribution. If a man was caught lying with another's wife, the injured husband held the right to kill him on the spot. Yet if the matter reached the Thing, fines could be levied sometimes in silver, sometimes in livestock, sometimes in land. Such payments did not erase the shame, but they soothed the wound enough for peace to be restored. Touch itself was regulated by unspoken boundaries. A stolen kiss, a hand upon a cloak at a feast, might seem small, yet could spark accusations if seen by the wrong eyes. Witnesses held power, for testimony before the Thing could ruin lives. To be accused was almost as damning as to be guilty, for rumours clung like frost, difficult to shake even after judgment. Women, though often voiceless in broader politics, could wield surprising authority in such matters. A wife, insulted or betrayed, could bring charges that unmade her husband's alliances. A daughter, shamed before marriage, could collapse the hopes of her kin to forge strong ties. In this way, intimacy was not just about the body, it was about survival, inheritance, and the fragile web of honor that bound communities together. The sagas offer glimpses of these tensions. A man who mocked another by claiming to have lain with his wife risked more than laughter, he risked death. A woman accused of being too free with her touch could find her marriage dissolved or her bride price diminished. These stories remind us that passion in the Viking Age was bound not by romance, but by duty, consequence, and law. Even acts that today might be called playful were dangerous in the Longhouse. A jest spoken too boldly, a verse composed too carelessly, could be interpreted as an admission. Poetry, especially, was perilous, for verses of love or lust became public property once recited. If a skald hinted too strongly about a woman not his own, the law could weigh his words as proof of crime. Thus the Vikings lived within a paradox. Passion was natural, fertility essential, desire undeniable, yet every touch was watched, judged, and weighed. Intimacy was never free of consequence. It was bound to honor, bound to survival, bound to law. And in the smoky halls and windswept things of the north, the laws of touch shaped lives as firmly as the swing of an axe. In the Viking world, marriage was not sealed with tender words alone, but with symbols heavy with meaning. At the wedding, a man placed his sword upon the lap of his bride. It was not merely a weapon, it was the mark of his bloodline, the steel that had defended his kin for generations. To give it was to entrust her with his honor, his ancestors, and his unborn heirs. In turn, the woman offered keys. Hung from her belt, they clinked softly as she walked, a sound that told all who heard that she commanded the household's stores and guarded its survival. Keys and swords, one for the hall, one for the field together, marked the joining of two lives. This ritual spoke of the deep bond between property, lineage, and intimacy. A woman who carried keys was not passive. She ruled the inside of the home, managing food, cloth, and servants. Her role was as vital as the man's labour and warfare beyond the threshold. Without her order, hunger would creep in and kin would falter. Yet her power was not free, it was tethered to her fertility. The sword demanded sons, and the keys were the promise that a household would be sustained until those sons were grown. Failure on either side could unravel the union. A man who lost his sword in cowardice dishonoured not only himself but his wife and children. A woman who could not guard the keys, or who was accused of barrenness, risked her standing. Together they embodied a fragile balance. Strength outside, order within. Neither could exist without the other, for without food, the warrior starved, and without defence, the hearth fell to ash. At the feast, when bride and groom drank from the same horn, the onlookers watched keenly. Every gesture was weighed, every glance between them judged. The exchange of sword and keys was more than ceremony, it was contract. Families witnessed it, thralls observed it, neighbours spoke of it for years. A wife who bore her keys with dignity could rise in respect. A husband who wielded his sword with courage could secure alliances. Together they embodied the future of kin. The sagas hold echoes of these unions. Women remembered not as silent wives, but as fierce keepers of households, whose decisions shaped fortunes. Men remembered not only for raids and battles, but for whether their families endured after them. The sword and keys were more than metal and iron, they were the lifeblood of survival, and their exchange made clear the responsibilities each carried. In the smoky longhouse, beneath the crackling of firewood, the keys would hang at the wife's side, their chime a quiet authority. The sword would rest nearby, its presence a reminder of blood owed and blood yet to come. Thus, marriage in the Viking Age was no simple joining of hearts. It was the binding of two powers, each essential, each dangerous if neglected. In those objects, cold and unyielding, lay the weight of love, duty, and survival. In Viking society, words carried the weight of steel, and poetry was as dangerous as a sword stroke. Skalds, the poets of the north, shaped reputation with their verses. Their songs could immortalize a man's courage or bury his honor beneath ridicule. Nowhere was this power more perilous than in matters of intimacy. A verse whispered at a feast, hinting at a man's weakness in the bed or a woman's rumoured indiscretion, could ruin lives faster than any blade. The Longhouse echoed with these contests of wit. As horns of ale passed from hand to hand, warriors and poets alike tested each other with sharp words. A single line, woven with clever metaphor, could sting deeper than a spear thrust. To accuse a man of being passive in love, or to imply that his wife found pleasure elsewhere, was to strip him bare before his kin. Such verses were not simply jest, they were challenges, demanding response. To remain silent was shame, to answer poorly was worse. Law codes revealed just how serious these words were. Certain insults, spoken in verse, were judged criminal. A man accused of perverse acts, or mocked for weakness, could demand satisfaction through holmgang, a duel fought until blood or death restored honour. Skaldic poetry, meant to entertain, became tinder for violence. Feasts often ended in spilled mead and drawn blades, the laughter of one moment turning to the clash of steel in the next. Women, too, were drawn into this dangerous game. A verse accusing a wife of infidelity might spread beyond the hall, whispered from farmstead to farmstead until her reputation collapsed. A woman's honour, bound to her chastity and loyalty, was fragile in the eyes of her kin. One careless poem could undo years of respect, and though some women were sharp-tongued enough to defend themselves, most relied on their brothers, fathers, or husbands to silence the poet, sometimes with silver, often with blood. The sagas preserve stories of poets punished for their tongues. Some were exiled, their words too poisonous to forgive. Others were slain outright, their clever rhymes silenced by the edge of an axe. Yet others survived. For a chieftain who kept a talented skald gained more than danger, he gained fame. Poets carried his deeds far and wide, ensuring his name would outlive him. To muzzle such power entirely was a risk few dared take. In the flickering firelight of the Longhouse, verse was both shield and spear. Men boasted of their prowess, women of their lineage, and all listened closely, weighing every syllable. To laugh was to choose sides. To ignore was to invite suspicion. The mockery of verse hung heavy in the smoky air, a reminder that in the Viking world the tongue could wound as surely as iron, and reputation was as fragile as breath on a winter morning. Fertility was more than a private concern in the Viking world, it was a sacred duty woven into every ritual of hearth and field. A man's seed and a woman's womb were not theirs alone, but the lifeblood of kin and community. Without children, a household weakened. Without heirs, a name faded into silence. Thus, fertility was celebrated openly, bound to the gods and to the cycles of earth itself. In feasts dedicated to Freya, the god of prosperity, carved phallic symbols were raised, sometimes placed upon wagons and paraded through the fields. They were not jest, but holy tokens, believed to bring strength to crops, herds, and human flesh alike. In households, small amulets shaped like hammers. Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, were hung above beds to bless unions and stir the seed of men. Women wore them on necklaces, hoping for safe childbirth, while men carried them as proof of their virility. Childbirth was not only expected, but demanded. A wife's value lay in her ability to bear sons and daughters to continue the line. Barrenness could shatter a marriage, leading to divorce spoken aloud at the hearth or doorway. The woman declared herself released, and the marriage dissolved like snow under spring Sunday. Yet, for those who bore children, honour and security grew with each birth. A mother was remembered not only in life but in death, buried with amulets and charms that marked her as the root of her kin. Sacrifice, too, was tied to fertility. Animals, boars, goats, even horses were offered at sacred groves or near fjords, their blood spilled to bless the land and stir abundance in wombs and fields alike. The community feasted on the meat, binding themselves together in a shared hope for new life. Songs were sung, verses spoken, and the air thick with smoke and prayer. Every act of union between man and woman echoed these rites, for the body itself was seen as a field to be sown, a mirror of the earth. The sagas whisper of women who prayed to Freya, goddess of love, to grant them children, and men who swore oaths before Thor's hammer to prove their potency. Fertility was not hidden, it was woven into the fabric of survival. To be fertile was to be favoured by the gods. To be barren was to walk under a cloud of doubt, whispered about in longhouses where nothing remained secret for long. In the smoky glow of the hearth, every cry of a newborn carried more weight than gold. It meant survival, continuity, and the blessing of ancestors. Fertility was sacred because without it, the Viking way of life could not endure. In every carved amulet, every whispered prayer, and every night of endurance beneath wool blankets, the sacred thread of fertility bound kin to gods, and men to women, as tightly as iron binds a shield. For Viking women, purity before marriage was a fragile treasure, guarded as carefully as gold or silver. A maiden's chastity was not merely her own, it was the honour of her kin, the bargaining weight in alliances, the unspoken dowry that could raise or ruin her household. In the smoky longhouses where nothing escaped the notice of kin, the faintest suspicion of impropriety could bring whispers that clung like frost. To be sullied before marriage, whether by choice or force, cast shame not only upon her, but upon every hand that had raised her. The sagas hint at this burden. Maidens are described with words that bind them to the image of untouched fields, ready to be sown by the right plough. Fathers and brothers guarded this symbol with sharp eyes, for a marriage alliance might hinge upon it. To offer a daughter with whispers of impurity was to bargain with cracked coin. Some men refused such unions outright, others accepted only with reduced dowries, marking the family's shame for all to see. Yet chastity was not only protection for the family, it was danger for the maiden herself. A girl caught in rumour's net had little voice to defend her. If a man boasted falsely of lying with her, she bore the wound more heavily than he. His reputation might grow in jest, but hers withered in silence. Her kin might demand blood, but the stain upon her name was rarely erased. In the eyes of the community, she carried the mark, even if the tale was untrue. The burden did not end at marriage. A wife who betrayed her husband's bed invited not only personal ruin, but the wrath of law. A husband could strike down the adulterer with steel, and the woman herself might be cast aside, her dowry forfeit, her children marked with doubt. The line between maidenly chastity and wifely fidelity was thin, yet both carried weight beyond the body. They were the pillars upon which honour rested. Archaeological finds speak quietly of this burden. Keys buried with women remind us of their authority in the household, yet that authority depended upon respect gained through chastity before marriage and loyalty after. Without these, the keys rang hollow, their sound mocking rather than commanding. Still, not all were powerless. Some sagas recall women who turned this burden into strength, weaving words at the thing to clear their names, or calling upon kin to defend them with sword and shield. Others embraced cunning, using silence, poetry, or clever bargains to shape their fate. But for most, chastity remained a weight carried from cradle to wedding bed, a constant reminder that their worth was bound to what they had withheld. In the glow of the hearth, where whispers travelled like sparks, the maiden sat beneath the eyes of all pure, guarded, and watched. The burden of chastity was not hers alone, but the heavy inheritance of her bloodline, and the measure by which her future was weighed. Unlike in much of medieval Europe, where a woman's fate was bound to her husband until death, The Viking world allowed a wife the rare power to walk away. Divorce was not hidden behind closed doors. It was spoken aloud, declared with ritual precision, and witnessed by kin. A woman could rise from her bed, step to the hearth, and before witnesses recite her release, she might do the same at the doorway of the longhouse, her voice echoing out into the cold air. In those words, her marriage ended. No priest was needed, no blessing withheld. Her freedom was hers to claim. This power was not granted lightly. The reasons were many. A husband who failed to provide, who struck his wife too often, who could not or would not perform his marital duties, who squandered wealth or dishonoured her kin. A barren union, too, might end at her choosing, for to remain in a childless bond was to wither her standing. The law gave her voice, but the weight of that voice depended on her courage and her kin's support. The sagas tell of women who used this right boldly. Some left husbands, weakened by age or misfortune, taking their dowries and seeking better alliances. Others abandoned men who failed them in the bed, whispering of shame that spread into laughter at feasts. In such cases, the wife who left did not vanish into silence. She carried her goods, her honour, and often her children, starting anew under the roof of another kin group. Divorce did not always destroy her. At times, it strengthened her, proving her independence in a world ruled by steel. Yet to leave was always dangerous. A woman without strong kin might find herself vulnerable, her honour questioned, her safety at risk. A husband scorned could lash out with violence, or with words that stained her reputation beyond repair. In such cases, the law might protect her, but only if her family stood firm at her side. Alone her right was fragile. Backed by her kin, it was iron. Archaeological traces hint at these women. Some graves contain women buried with wealth and independence, unmarked by a man's presence. Perhaps they were widows, perhaps divorcees who lived freely until death. Their keys still hung at their sides, not as symbols of another's household, but of authority they carried themselves. The wife who left stood as both warning and inspiration. To some men, she was a threat, a reminder that honour was demanded not only on the battlefield, but in the bed and at the hearth. To women, she was proof that silence was not the only path. Her voice, spoken at the bed, the hearth, or the door, carried the power to reshape her life. In the longhouse, where smoke curled and whispers spread, such moments were remembered for generations. The wife who left was never forgotten, for her steps marked the threshold not just of a home, but of freedom in a world bound by honour. Among the most haunting shadows in the Viking world were the enslaved, whose bodies were treated as tools, their voices silenced beneath the weight of ownership. Captured in raids across Ireland, the Baltic, and Slavic lands, these women and men were brought into longhouses, not as kin, but as property. They stoked the hearths, hauled water from frozen wells, tended to livestock, and, all too often, warmed the beds of their masters without consent. Their bodies were bargaining chips, tokens of conquest, and reminders of the cruel price of expansion. For enslaved women, intimacy was stripped of choice. To resist was futile, for their bodies were already considered possessions. They bore children whose status hovered in a liminal space half recognized, half denied. If a master claimed them, such offspring might find a place within the kin, though often marked by whispers. If not, they lived with the weight of illegitimacy, their future uncertain, their bloodline fragile as glass. To be born of enslavement was to walk in the half-light of society, never fully belonging. The sagas rarely grant voice to these women, but their silence is telling. Their presence is felt in the background, unnamed thralls in smoky halls, nameless mothers of warriors, forgotten labourers whose toil allowed the free to feast. Archaeology, too, offers glimpses. Skeletons with signs of malnutrition, graves without goods, chains rusted into the earth. They remind us that beneath the splendour of silver hoards and dragon-proud ships lay the suffering of countless forgotten lives. Enslaved men carried burdens of a different kind. Their honor stripped, they were denied the identity of warriors. Mockery often reduced them further, painting them as unmanly, submissive, and weak. If forced into sexual service, their shame was doubled, for in the eyes of Viking society, such roles marked them as less than men, bound forever to dishonor. Unlike free men, they could not defend themselves with steel or law. Their silence was enforced, their bodies conscripted into humiliation. And yet, within this silence, survival flickered. Some enslaved women bore children who rose to prominence, woven into the fabric of clans through necessity or recognition. Some men earned freedom through loyalty, craft, or sheer endurance, though the scars of their bondage never truly faded. The enslaved body endured, and through endurance left traces that echo still. The Longhouse bore witness to all of this. While free men and women argued, feasted, and coupled under the watchful hearth, the enslaved lingered at the edges, ever present, ever used, yet rarely acknowledged. Their bodies carried the hidden history of Viking sexuality, the shadow beneath the boasting, the silence beneath the songs. In a society that prized honor, their dishonor was forced, their choices erased, and yet, without them, the great households could not have thrived. The enslaved body, though silenced, sustained the very world that denied its humanity, leaving behind a legacy as enduring as the sagas themselves. In the smoky glow of the Longhouse hearth, a wife's place was secure only so long as her husband's eyes did not stray too boldly. While Viking law gave her authority over the household and its stores, her standing was always vulnerable to the whispers of concubines or the allure of foreign women brought back from raids. Jealousy was not a hidden feeling, but a force that could fracture families, ignite feuds, and shift the balance of power within a hall. The sagas speak of wives who endured with clenched jaws as their husbands flaunted their concubines. Some bore the insult in silence, hoping time would restore their place. Others struck back with sharp tongues, their words laced with venom at feasts, cutting down rivals with accusations that could not be ignored. A wife's wrath was no small matter, for to mock or challenge her openly was to invite the scorn of her kin, who might rise in her defence. Jealousy often expressed itself through subtle acts of resistance. A wife could withhold her keys, denying her husband access to the stores she controlled. Without her cooperation, the household faltered grain, was rationed poorly, cloth withheld, servants left untended. Her silent defiance could bleed a man's pride as surely as a wound in battle. Yet such defiance was perilous. Too much resistance risked divorce or even violence, for while women held rights, men still wielded the sword. Some sagas recall more violent outcomes. Wives who poisoned rivals, wives who plotted with their kin to drive concubines from the hall, wives who threatened to abandon their husbands entirely if the insult grew unbearable. These stories reveal that jealousy was not simply private emotion, but public spectacle, shaping alliances and reshaping reputations. A woman who allowed herself to be displaced risked mockery. A woman who fought back too fiercely risked being remembered as unruly. Both paths carried danger. For the husband, managing jealousy was a matter of survival as well. To flaunt his affairs too openly was to risk losing the respect of his wife's kin, whose support often anchored his own status. Marriage was not merely about companionship, but about alliance, and to dishonour a wife was to dishonour the family who had given her. The jealous wife thus stood not alone, but as a symbol of her kin's pride. Her voice, though often raised in private quarrels, could echo into the thing if matters became too grave. Archaeology suggests that some women held their ground fiercely. Graves of wealthy wives, buried with keys, jewelry, and symbols of authority, reveal women who retained their status despite rivalries in life. Their power lay not only in fertility, but in the strength of their presence, a reminder that a jealous wife could also be a formidable one. In the end, jealousy was a fire that smouldered in every hall. It crackled in whispered words, in withheld glances, in the cold silence between husband and wife. And when it flared into open conflict, it could burn as hot as any torch, consuming not only households, but the fragile bonds of honour that held Viking society together. The shield wall bound men together more closely than any blood oath. Shoulder to shoulder, they stood as one body, their breaths mingling in the mist, their lives depending on the steadiness of the man at their side. In such closeness, bonds of loyalty and affection were forged that could last a lifetime. Brothers in arms clasped one another in embraces after battle, wept over each other's wounds, and swore oaths of undying loyalty. Yet in this world of iron and honour, boundaries of flesh were sharply drawn, and to cross them even in jest was to court destruction. The sagas record moments of deep intimacy between warriors, words of devotion that read to later eyes like love. Yet for the Vikings, such loyalty was framed not in the language of romance, but of honour and kinship. To fight and die together was the highest form of union a man could know. But to suggest that this closeness extended into the bed was unthinkable. The insult of being accused of passivity, of being the one used, was one of the worst that could be spoken. It was an attack not just on the man's body, but on his very soul, his standing as free and honourable. Feasts often tested these boundaries. Men drunk on mead might boast of their closeness, swearing that no bond was greater than theirs. But if a rival poet or enemy sought to twist such devotion into innuendo, the hall could erupt into bloodshed. A single mocking verse, hinting that a warrior had crossed into forbidden flesh, demanded response. Silence meant acceptance. To deny with words was rarely enough. Only steel, drawn in anger, could clear a man's name once such poison was spoken aloud. Yet, the danger of slander reveals the depth of these bonds. For men to be so fiercely protective of their reputation shows how vital these friendships were. A warrior trusted his comrade with his back in battle, with his secrets in camp, and sometimes with his very survival in hostile lands. The intimacy of war, where men lived, ate, and slept side by side, bred closeness that outsiders might not understand. But while affection was praised, any hint of transgression beyond loyalty could ruin them both. Women, too, sometimes watched these bonds with unease. A wife might fear her husband's loyalty to his comrade outweighed his loyalty to her. Families worried that warriors bound too tightly to each other would neglect alliances made through marriage. In such cases, jealousy and suspicion gnawed at households, even when no boundary had been crossed. The line was clear yet fragile, a boundary both sacred and perilous. To embrace a comrade was honour, to love him in flesh was ruin. Thus the Viking world praised loyalty, but feared desire, locking intimacy into the language of battle, not the bed. Brothers in arms stood unshaken, but the boundaries of flesh remained as sharp as the edges of their blades. Fertility was not left to chance in the Viking world. It was bound to ritual, woven into feasts, offerings, and sacred symbols that merged the body with the soil. To plant grain in spring was not merely agriculture. It was a mirror of what men and women enacted in the longhouse, the sowing of seed to ensure survival. The two were inseparable. Without fertile fields and fertile wombs, no kin could endure the long winters. At festivals dedicated to Freya, the god of abundance, great gatherings celebrated this truth. Farmers led sacred boars through the fields, their bristled backs glistening with ale and blood from ritual offerings. The boar, Freya's animal, symbolized virility, and its sacrifice bound the land to human desire. The blood was sprinkled upon ploughs, upon fields, and even upon newly wedded couples, a reminder that sowing and seeding were one and the same. In the longhouse, this understanding shaped intimate unions. A husband and wife joined not merely for pleasure, but as an echo of the earth itself. Their bodies were fields and furrows, tasked with carrying life forward. Birth was not private, it was the triumph of household and gods. The child's cry confirmed that the ritual of seed had been successful, the cycle unbroken. Archaeological finds speak of wooden carvings and stone amulets shaped like phalluses, hidden beneath beds or placed in graves. These were not crude jokes, but charms, blessings for fertility. Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, itself carried this double-meaning protector in battle, stirrer of life in the bed. Women wore it around their necks when they hoped for children. Men carried it into their marriage beds as a silent promise of potency. Feasts often reinforced these rituals. At Yule, as darkness pressed hardest upon the land, mead flowed freely, and unions were encouraged beneath cloaks and furs. These were not nights of shame, but of necessity, for every child born the following autumn carried the hope of the community. Laughter, song, and flesh mingled with prayers to gods of growth, for without them the next harvest might falter. Yet the ritual of seed also brought fear. A barren union was considered a broken field, cursed by gods or weakened by hidden fault. Wives prayed to Freya, goddess of fertility and love, for strength to bear children. Husbands sought omens, fearing their own weakness or the disfavour of the divine. Such anxiety pressed heavily upon households, for the failure of fertility threatened not only love but survival itself. Thus the act of planting seed, whether in soil or in flesh, was never without weight. Each union was more than desire. It was a ritual, a binding contract between humans and gods, between kin and earth. In every whispered prayer, in every carved charm, and in every night spent beneath smoke-dark rafters, the Vikings remembered that life itself was sacred sowing. Their survival rested upon it, and they treated the ritual with the reverence of warriors lifting their swords. Few ordeals in the Viking world carried both reverence and terror as heavily as childbirth. For women, it was the battlefield of the body, where honour was won not with sword and shield, but with endurance and blood. The longhouse that echoed with laughter during feasts also trembled with screams during labour, and the fire that gave warmth by night bore witness to the most dangerous act a woman could endure. To die in childbirth was not shame but valour, a sacrifice as sacred as falling with a blade in hand. The sagas and law codes reveal fragments of this truth. Women who perished giving life were sometimes honoured with the same reverence as warriors. Their graves, often rich with amulets and charms, suggest that kin saw them as protectors of lineage, martyrs of survival. For every child that lived, a mother risked her own death. In the absence of physicians or modern care, midwives relied on herbs, whispered prayers, and steady hands to guide both mother and child through the storm. Still, many did not survive, their blood soaking the straw of the birthing bed. The community watched with tense silence. Husbands paced outside, clutching amulets to their chests, praying to the gods for a safe delivery. Women gathered to assist, their experience forged by countless births before. Children were shooed to the far end of the hall, though they could not escape the sounds, the cries of agony, the urgent whispers, the sudden silence when a life slipped away. In those moments, the fragility of survival weighed heavy upon all. Yet childbirth was also a triumph, a renewal of the household. The cry of a newborn broke the tension, filling the hall with relief and joy. Kin raised drinking horns to celebrate, thanking Freya, Frigg, or Thor for their blessings. A woman who bore many children rose in honour, her fertility strengthening the bonds of family and securing the lineage. She became the root of the clan, the living thread binding past to future. Still, fear never vanished. A barren woman, or one who lost child after child, lived under shadow. Whispers spread quickly in longhouses, where nothing was secret, and her status weakened with every failure. Some were cast aside, divorced at the hearth, their dowries returned, their reputations scarred. Others endured in silence, their sorrow buried beneath daily labour. Archaeology offers glimpses of this burden. Graves of young women, buried with infants or small charms, tell silent stories of lives cut short. The amulets, Thor's hammers, herbs, beads, were meant to protect them, but often they served only as farewell offerings. The blood of childbirth, unseen in sagas of warriors, was as vital to Viking survival as any battle won at sea or shore. Every child born was a victory, every mother who lived a blessing, every woman who died a reminder that life itself was won through sacrifice. In the dim glow of the hearth, where screams turned to silence or to a newborn's cry, the Vikings witnessed the greatest struggle of all, the peril and power of giving life. In the Viking world, lineage was the thread that wove honour through generations. A child born within marriage was a torch, carrying the flame of kin into the future. But a child born outside wedlock carried a shadow, called bastards by later tongues. Such children lived under the burden of uncertain standing, acknowledged by blood, yet questioned by society. Their worth depended not on their own deeds, but on whether their father chose to raise them to the firelight or let them drift in the darkness of half-rights. The sagas speak of such offspring often. Some rose to greatness, their fathers bold enough to name them before witnesses, granting them claim to land and inheritance. Others were left to obscurity, their mothers mocked, their names whispered with scorn. A man's choice to recognize or reject his child carried ripples across the hall. To acknowledge a child born of a concubine or a fleeting union might divide a household, angering a wife and her kin. To deny such a child, however, risked breaking the bond of blood, a sacred thread even the gods respected. At the Thing, disputes over inheritance were fierce, and bastards stood at the heart of many quarrels. Brothers of different mothers clashed, their claims sharpened by the tongues of kin and neighbours. A son born of a wife might argue that his blood was purer, his right unquestioned. A son of a concubine or thrall, if recognised, could still wield his father's name as weapon, demanding his share of land and cattle. Such quarrels often spilled into violence, for property was survival, and survival left no room for compromise. For the mothers, the burden was heavier still. A woman who bore a child outside marriage carried the stain of dishonour, no matter the circumstances. If she was enslaved, her silence was assumed as consent, yet the child she bore might grow to walk among the free. If she was unmarried, her kin bore the shame, their alliances weakened, their name whispered as careless. Only the child's future recognition could cleanse her, and even then the mark lingered. Archaeology hints at these tangled stories. Graves of children buried with few goods, their status uncertain, lie beside richer burials of kin. Some young were interred with tokens of respect, perhaps recognized bastards raised within the household. Others were laid to rest in silence, their names lost, their lives recorded only in the shallow earth. Yet the sagas also remind us that greatness was not denied to those born in shadow. Legendary heroes and kings were said to be born outside wedlock, their strength and cunning lifting them beyond stigma. Still, their rise always carried the memory of their burden, shaping their hunger for honour, their need to prove themselves in battle and in law. Thus, in the smoky longhouses and before the open things, the bastard's burden weighed heavy. It was a life lived between worlds, neither fully inside nor entirely cast out. Each step was watched, each deed measured, for in a society where blood defined destiny, the bastard carried both the curse of doubt and the chance for greatness. Beneath the noise of feasts and the clang of weapons, the Viking world carried another rhythm, the quiet pulse of unspoken desire. Not every passion found voice in the longhouse. Not every longing could be declared before kin or gods. Many carried their secrets in silence, hiding them behind duty, work, and ritual. These hidden flames shaped lives as surely as public oaths, for silence was a language of its own. Men carved runes upon sticks or stones, their meanings veiled but sharp with feeling. Archaeologists have uncovered fragments inscribed with words of yearning, small tokens, buried in earth or carried in pouches, never meant for public eyes. Such carvings were confessions etched into wood, prayers that the gods might see what mortals could not. Women, too, found ways to weave their longing into cloth, a thread of unusual colour, a secret pattern in a border, small signals hidden in the endless labour of weaving, understood only by the one for whom it was meant. The sagas whisper of these hidden loves. A warrior, sworn to another's sister, carried longing in silence as he fought beside her kin. A woman, bound to a loveless marriage, kept her heart fixed upon a man she could never have. These stories rarely ended in fulfillment. More often, they ended in tragedy, for silence eventually gave way to rumour, and rumour brought judgment sharper than any blade. In the crowded hall, longing was suffocating. Privacy was scarce, and every word, every glance, was weighed by watchful eyes. To look too long at another's wife was to invite mockery, perhaps even a duel. To whisper too softly in a corner was to risk suspicion, yet desire did not vanish because it was forbidden. It lived in stolen looks across the fire, in the brush of hands as cloaks passed, in the pause before words unsaid. For women, silent longing was both a torment and a survival. To speak openly of desire for another man was unthinkable, risking not only her own life but the standing of her kin. For men, it was no less dangerous. To claim another's wife, in thought or word, was to dishonour both families. Thus longing lived in the shadows, shaping behaviour, influencing choices, and sometimes driving men to reckless deeds that shattered peace. The burden of silence was heavy. It carved lines into faces. It sharpened songs into melancholy verses. A skald might cloak his longing in metaphor, singing of the sea yearning for the shore, of the falcon forever circling the mountain peak. Listeners might hear only beauty, but those who knew understood the truth hidden beneath. Silent longing was part of survival in a society where desire was dangerous. It burned quietly, like embers beneath ash, never fully extinguished. And though few sagas name it plainly, it lingers in the pauses of their stories, in the half-said words, in the gestures too small to note. In the Viking world, not every passion roared like fire, some smouldered unseen, shaping lives in silence. The feast was both celebration and battlefield. Beneath the high rafters of the longhouse, with smoke drifting in heavy curls and torches spitting sparks, men and women gathered to eat, drink, and boast. Platters of roasted meat passed down the benches, horns of mead flowed without pause, and the skald's voice wove tales of glory. Yet, as night deepened and the ale loosened tongues, laughter often sharpened into cruelty. For in the Viking world, mockery was more than jest, it was a weapon, and at the feast, reputations could be torn apart as surely as bodies on the battlefield. No man's honour was safe once the drinking reached its height. Warriors jeered at one another's scars, claiming they had been won in cowardice rather than courage. Husbands were taunted with sly grins about wives who stirred restlessly at night. A single joke about weakness in the bed could silence an entire hall, followed by roars of laughter or the sudden scrape of steel as the insulted man rose to defend himself. To endure mockery without response was unthinkable, for silence meant agreement. Words demanded words, or, failing that, blood. Wives and women, too, were targets of drunken tongues. Their chastity or loyalty might be questioned, their fertility mocked. A barren woman could be likened to an empty field, a wife with wandering eyes compared to cattle that strayed from its pen. Such words stung deeply, for a woman's honour was bound not only to herself but to her kin. A jest about her could dishonour her entire family, and her brothers or father might rise in fury at the slight. The skalds, masters of words, wielded the most dangerous power. Their verses, rich with metaphor, could immortalise a man in shame as easily as in glory. A single mocking stanza, carried from hall to hall, could follow a warrior for the rest of his life. The sagas recall men who killed poets for such insults, their anger too great to be cooled by silver or peace weaving. And yet, the same scolds were courted by chieftains, for their skill brought fame as well as peril. Mockery at the feast was not always destructive. Sometimes it served as test, a way to measure the strength of one's tongue as well as one's sword. A man who answered a cutting jest with sharper wit earned respect, his cleverness praised as much as his courage. A woman who parried with her own retort could silence her detractors and even gain renown for her boldness. The feast was as much arena of words as the battlefield was of weapons. Still, the danger lingered in every laugh. Too many jests, or one poorly timed barb, could ignite violence. Horns were overturned, benches splintered, steel drawn in the glow of the fire. Thus, every feast balanced joy and peril. Food and drink bound the hall in fellowship, but mockery prowled at its edges, ready to turn celebration into bloodshed. In the Viking world, the feast was never just a meal, it was trial, theatre, and combat of the tongue, where honour could rise or fall with a single laugh. In the Viking household, enslaved men bore a burden far heavier than chains. Their bodies, stripped of freedom, carried the brand of dishonour in a society that measured worth through strength, lineage, and the ability to defend one's name with steel. A thrall could not fight a duel to restore his standing, nor could he claim honour through ancestry. Worse still, he lived under the constant shadow of humiliation, mocked for weakness, used at will, and denied the very qualities that made a man free in the north. Unlike women, whose enslavement was often tied to labour or concubinage, enslaved men endured an erasure of masculinity itself. They were forbidden from bearing weapons, denied the right to sit at the benches of freemen, and excluded from the thing where men shaped law and judgment. In this exclusion, their very manhood was questioned. They could labour, sweat and bleed, but they could not fight for their own names. To live without honour was, in Viking eyes, to live half a life. The greatest shame for an enslaved man was the insinuation of sexual submission. In a culture where dominance defined masculinity, to be forced into passivity, whether in labour, insult, or intimacy, was to be unmade. Law codes hint at this unspoken terror, condemning men who hurled such accusations at freemen, for the words alone could provoke blood feud. Yet enslaved men, with no legal voice, had no shield against such treatment. Their silence was enforced, their suffering invisible to those who ruled them. In the sagas, thralls appear at the edges of stories unnamed, faceless, often mocked. They are beaten, ordered, and killed without consequence. Their inner lives are not described, their struggles left in shadow. But archaeology whispers what sagas silence. Poor graves with few or no goods, bones scarred by heavy labour, signs of malnutrition, all tell of lives spent in toil and indignity. These men, though absent from verse, built the farms, rowed the ships, and sustained the very halls that erased them. Yet, even in this silence, traces of resistance remain. Some enslaved men fled, vanishing into forests or hiding among distant kin. Others earned freedom through loyalty or craft, their owners granting them release in old age or as reward. But even when freed, the stain of slavery clung to them, their honour forever questioned. Their children, though technically free, often bore the same whispers, their blood marked by the shame of their father's bondage. For the Vikings, whose society balanced on the edge of honour and shame, the enslaved man embodied the deepest fear, the loss of autonomy, the stripping of masculinity, the denial of voice. His life was a reminder of what could befall any man, should fortune fail him in battle or fate turn cruel. In the smoky longhouse, while freemen boasted and feasted, the enslaved man moved quietly, unseen, his shame a cloak heavier than any chain. His silence was enforced, but his presence haunted the edges of Viking life, a living echo of conquest and the cost of survival. In a world where a woman's authority was often bound to her husband's strength, widowhood transformed the balance. When a Viking man died, whether on the battlefield, at sea, or in the hall, his wife stepped into a space that few women elsewhere in Europe could claim. The widow, unmoored from the rule of her husband, often gained new freedom. Her keys, once symbols of shared duty, became the sole mark of authority. She might hold land, wealth, and the fate of her children in her own hands, standing as matriarch in a society that respected power wherever it was found. The sagas speak of widows who wielded sharp tongues and sharper judgment. Some commanded their households with iron will, keeping warriors and thralls alike in order. Others became patrons of feasts, pouring out mead with dignity, their benches filled with guests who sought their favour. A widow could inherit her husband's farm, oversee trade, and even arrange marriages for her children. In such roles, she became both guardian and strategist, ensuring her kin's survival while weaving alliances anew. This power, however, came with peril. Without a husband to shield her, the widow's position could be challenged by greedy relatives, ambitious neighbours, or even rivals within her own household. Some were pressured into remarriage, their wealth and authority absorbed into another man's line. Others resisted, wielding the law at the thing to defend their rights. Norse legal codes granted widows standing to represent themselves, a rare acknowledgement of their independence. A strong widow with loyal kin could hold her ground as firmly as any chieftain. Jealousy and suspicion often surrounded such women. A widow who thrived without a husband was both admired and feared. Whispers might accuse her of cunning too sharp, of wielding influence beyond her place. The sagas sometimes portray these women as dangerous, weaving plots that shaped the fates of kings. Yet these tales also reveal admiration, for to survive widowhood with strength was to earn lasting respect. Archaeological finds confirm the reality of this power. Graves of widows have been uncovered rich with goods keys, brooches, weaving tools, and sometimes even weapons. These burials suggest women who commanded households, whose authority was recognized even in death. Their keys, buried at their sides, symbolized not subservience but dominion, marking them as keepers of wealth and lineage. Still, widowhood was also a life of burden. Grief weighed heavy, and survival was never guaranteed. Many widows carried the responsibility of raising children alone, protecting them from hunger and dishonor while fending off threats from outside. Their nights were long, their decisions heavy, yet their resilience was etched into memory, for kin would recall the widow who held the household together when all else faltered. In the smoky longhouse, the widow's presence was unmistakable. No longer bound to obey, she spoke with authority, her words shaping the course of her family's fate. Her power was forged from loss, her strength from necessity. And in a society that measured worth in survival, the widow stood as proof that women, too, could carry the weight of legacy upon their shoulders. The Viking longhouse was never truly dark, never truly still. Even in the depth of night, when the fire sank low and the rafters groaned in the cold, there were always eyes awake. Offspring stirred restlessly under woolen blankets, thralls shifted in corners, and animals tied inside for warmth rustled against their ropes. In such a crowded hall, nothing unfolded without witness. Intimacy, though shielded by cloaks and whispers, was part of this communal life. The watchers, unseen yet ever present, grew up with knowledge that belonged to all. Children absorbed these lessons long before they could understand them. They heard the hushed tones of their parents, the sighs muffled beneath fur, the laughter or the silence that followed. To them, intimacy was not hidden, but another rhythm of household life, as natural as the creak of timber or the crackle of firewood. They carried these impressions with them, shaping their understanding of honour, duty, and fertility. To be raised in a longhouse was to learn by watching, even when one was not meant to see. Thralls, too, became unwilling witnesses. Servants tending the fire or carrying water could not close their ears to the sounds around them. Their silence was enforced, for a thrall who gossiped risked punishment. Yet their memories lingered, and in rare cases their whispers slipped out, carried like sparks to ignite rumour. A careless word from an unseen watcher could unmake reputations, for in a hall where nothing was secret, even silence was fragile. This constant observation bound intimacy to reputation. A man who pleased his wife too boldly, or a woman who showed too much joy, risked laughter the next day from those who had overheard. A husband who failed, his wife's sighs replaced by restless silence, carried shame that others pretended not to see but never forgot. Thus, the unseen watchers became judges, even if their judgment was unspoken. Their memories weighed heavily, for every act was measured against the harsh scales of honor. The sagas give hints of these quiet witnesses. Stories of insults, hurled at feasts, often draw on knowledge that could only have come from observation. A man mocked for failing his wife, a woman ridiculed for her wandering eyes. Such accusations revealed that someone, somewhere, had seen or heard what was meant to remain hidden. The unseen watchers gave fuel to the verses of poets, their silent knowledge sharpened into public shame. For those who lived beneath the smoky beams, this was the nature of life. Privacy was a dream unknown to them. To share space was to share secrets, willingly or not. And in that sharing, bonds were forged, sometimes strong, sometimes fragile, always vulnerable. Thus the unseen watchers shaped the Viking household as much as any sword or key. Their eyes preserved the unspoken truths of the hall. Their ears gathered whispers like kindling for the fires of rumour. They were children, thralls, neighbours, kin, all silent witnesses to the intimate theatre of survival, whose memories stretched longer than any cloak could cover. Rumour in the Viking world was a drink stronger than mead, bitterer than seawater, and more dangerous than any blade. It flowed swiftly through longhouses and settlements, passing from mouth to mouth until it thickened into truth. A neighbour's raised brow, a thrall's careless whisper, or the faintest hint of impropriety could become a story retold at feasts, reshaped in each telling until reputations were undone. In a society where honour was fragile and reputation the very shield of survival, rumour could strike harder than a sword blow. The longhouse, with its crowded benches and smoky rafters, was the perfect cradle for such talk. Nothing remained private in its narrow space. A wife's sigh of discontent, a husband's lingering glance toward another woman, or a servant's knowledge of a secret meeting, all of these could take root in whispers. Even when no proof existed, suspicion was enough to stain. For in the Viking mind, the possibility of dishonour carried nearly the same weight as dishonour itself. Rumour did not remain confined within walls. At the Thing, where disputes were brought before the free men of the community, accusations often rested not on evidence but on testimony, shaped by stories already whispered for weeks. A man accused of weakness in the bed, or a woman charged with unfaithfulness, found their fates tied to the currents of gossip. Even if absolved, the mark lingered. Reputation, once tarnished, was difficult to restore. Feasts gave rumour its wings. In the haze of drink and song, tongues loosened, and jest blended with accusation. A single mocking verse, born from overheard whispers, could spread across fjords. A husband might laugh at his neighbour's shame, never knowing his own household was already the subject of quiet talk. In this way, rumour became both weapon and shield, used by rivals to weaken each other, wielded by kin to defend their pride, and feared by all who had something to lose. For women, the bitter drink of rumour was especially perilous. A wife accused of infidelity, even without proof, could find her dowry endangered, her children's legitimacy questioned, and her place in the hall shaken. For men, rumour of passivity in intimacy was equally ruinous, an insult that stripped away honour and demanded redress. Thus, gossip rarely remained mere words. It often erupted into duels, blood feuds, or legal battles at the Thing. The sagas carry the echoes of these poisoned tales, heroes undone not by sword but by verse, families torn apart by whispered doubts. A single word planted in the right ear could topple alliances more effectively than an army. Archaeological traces of burned farmsteads remind us that some of these feuds ignited into open war, all because of whispers that began beside a hearth. In the Viking world, rumour was more than idle talk. It was a current running beneath every hall, unseen yet always present, capable of carrying men and women to ruin. To drink of it was to taste bitterness that lingered, for once swallowed, rumour could never be spat back out. It clung, shaping lives, marriages, and bloodlines, as surely as any law spoken beneath the open sky. In the Viking world, adultery was not a hidden sin whispered in shame. It was a crime bound to honour and punished with blood or silver. Marriage was more than companionship. It was alliance, sealed with dowry, bride price, and the weight of kinship. To break that bond by straying was to shatter trust not only between husband and wife, but between families whose futures were tied together. Thus, adultery was judged as harshly as theft or violence, for it threatened survival itself. The law codes, preserved in later Icelandic texts, speak clearly. A man who caught another in bed with his wife had the right to kill him on the spot. Such vengeance was not considered murder, but justice, for he had defended his honour, his household, and his lineage. The wife, too, bore consequence. She might be cast aside, her dowry forfeited, her name shamed. The accusation alone, if believed, could undo her standing, whether or not she had strayed. Adultery trials often unfolded at the Thing, where accusations were weighed before the assembly. Witnesses carried enormous power, for a servant's word or a neighbour's claim could tip judgment. If guilt was proven, fines were imposed silver, livestock, or land, depending on the station of those involved. Yet fines could not mend honour. Even when peace was bought, the stain lingered, and the couple's future was forever marked by suspicion. For women, the stakes were especially dire. A wife accused of adultery could lose not only her household, but her children, for their legitimacy would be questioned. In some cases, her kin disowned her, seeing her dishonour as a weight too heavy to bear. Some sagas tell of women driven away, forced to seek refuge with distant relatives, or even abandoned altogether. Yet others reveal women who fought back using sharp words, cunning arguments, or appeals to law to defend their names. Men, too, were vulnerable, though in different ways. To be accused of adultery with another man's wife risked not only his life, but his standing in the community. Even if he escaped death at the husband's hand, he might be mocked, fined, or challenged to holmgang. The danger lay not in passion, but in discovery. What was hidden in the shadows could remain tolerable. What was revealed beneath the firelight of the hall demanded redress. Adultery also carried political weight. Rivals used accusations to weaken alliances, spreading whispers that undermined trust between households. A feud might begin not over cattle or land, but over a wife's supposed indiscretion. In such cases, truth mattered less than perception. The accusation itself, once spoken, could not be unsaid. The Longhouse, ever watchful, bore witness to these dramas. Servants noticed glances, children overheard whispers, neighbours repeated what they saw or thought they saw. And once adultery was named, it became law's concern, a matter for judgment, vengeance, or blood. Thus the law of adultery loomed over every union, a reminder that intimacy was never without consequence. In a world where honour was survival, straying from the marital bed was not only betrayal, it was a crime that could destroy households, fracture kin, and spill blood across the hearth. In the Viking Age, poetry was sharper than steel. A verse could crown a man with glory, immortalizing his deeds in halls far beyond his own, but it could also destroy him. Words carried weight heavier than gold, and when tied to matters of intimacy, they became deadly. To hint in verse that a woman had strayed, or that a man was weak in the bed, was to hurl a weapon that cut deeper than any axe. The sagas preserve the memory of such moments, when a single poem spilled blood before dawn. Feasts were the stage for these verbal duels. Skalds, skilled in weaving riddles and kennings, often performed before lords and chieftains, their tongues gilded with mead, yet in their verses lay danger. A careless metaphor could be taken as insult, a double meaning as accusation. If a skald implied that a man had lain with another's wife, the hall could erupt. The laughter of some was the humiliation of another, and once the words were spoken, they could not be recalled. Law codes treated such slander seriously. Sexual insults, especially those implying passivity or adultery, were considered so grave that they justified violence. A man mocked in verse could challenge the speaker to holmgang, a duel upon an island or marked ground where steel would decide whose words carried truth. If the poet lost, his body lay bleeding on the earth, his tongue silenced forever. If he won, his verse became immortal, carried from hall to hall as proof of his dominance. Thus, poetry was not only art, it was a battlefield. For women, a poem could unmake an entire life. To be named in verse as unfaithful, whether true or not, marked her forever. Even if her husband defended her, suspicion lingered. Families weighed her value less, alliances faltered, and whispers clung like smoke in the rafters. Some sagas recall women who begged their kin to silence poets, their reputations at stake with every word sung. Others tell of wives who turned the insult back, weaving sharp retorts of their own, though such boldness carried risks of its own. Archaeology cannot capture words, but it reminds us of their power. Stones carved with runes show fragments of verse, declarations of love or honour. If such inscriptions could survive for centuries, imagine the weight of a poem spoken aloud in a crowded hall. Once heard, it lived in memory, passed from mouth to mouth, never dying. Thus, a single poem could kill in two ways, with steel drawn in its aftermath, or with shame that lingered until death. The poet's tongue was a blade, his verses spears hurled across the firelit benches. In the Viking world, where honour was everything, the poem that killed was no metaphor. It was a reality, feared and respected, proving that sometimes words left deeper wounds than weapons ever could. The gods of the north were not bound by mortal laws of flesh. They crossed boundaries freely, their forms shifting, their desires unrestrained, their stories woven with acts that blurred the very lines men guarded so fiercely. To the Vikings, these tales were not scandal but revelation, reflections of a world where fertility, strength, and cunning mattered more than rigid notions of purity. The gods showed that power itself could be fluid, and that survival sometimes demanded shapes both strange and unsettling. Loki was the most notorious of all. Trickster, deceiver, and shapeshifter, he embodied the danger of blurred lines. Once, to distract a giant, he took the form of a mare, luring away a stallion. From that union, Loki bore a foal, Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse, who became Odin's steed. To later ages this tale might shock, but for the Vikings it revealed something deeper, that cunning, even in strange guises, could bring forth power greater than steel. Sleipnir was no shame, but a gift, born from trickery, that saved the gods themselves. Freya, goddess of love and fertility, was equally unbound. She wept tears of gold for lost lovers, took many partners, and wielded her desires without apology. Tales spoke of her trading her body for the necklace Brisingamen, a jewel of unmatched beauty. Yet she was not diminished by this act. Instead, her story reinforced her role as mistress of fertility, wealth, and desire, embodying the sacred truth that sexuality was entwined with survival and prosperity. Even Odin, the All-Father, defied fixed roles. In pursuit of knowledge, he practiced seither, a form of magic associated with women. This act blurred the strict lines of masculinity, and he was mocked for it. Yet Odin's power grew from this crossing, showing that wisdom demanded sacrifice, even the sacrifice of reputation. The lesson was clear. What mortals scorned as weakness, the gods could wield as strength. For the Vikings, These divine tales mirrored the chaos and necessity of their own lives. Fertility rites, strange amulets, and whispered rituals echoed the gods' unbounded acts. If the gods could shapeshift, could blur roles, could embrace desire beyond mortal law, then human transgressions, though dangerous, were not beyond comprehension. The gods themselves carried both honour and shame, yet their power endured. The sagas did not soften these stories. They told them plainly, leaving listeners to draw meaning. Some heard warnings, others inspiration. A warrior mocked for weakness might recall Odin's mastery of Seether. A woman judged harshly might remember Freya's unapologetic freedom. In these tales lay both peril and permission, depending on who chose to listen. Thus the shape-shifting gods stood as mirrors, reflecting the complexities of Viking sexuality. They reminded mortals that life was not fixed but fluid, that survival often required bending the rules of flesh and honour. In their strange unions and blurred roles, the gods carried truths too dangerous for men to speak, yet too powerful to ignore. Their stories lingered, whispered beside smoky hearths, shaping the way Vikings understood desire, shame, and survival itself. Marriage in the Viking world was not shaped by love alone, but by trade. Every union was a transaction, binding families together with silver, land, and livestock. The bride was not sold in the sense of slavery, yet her hand was bargained with the same gravity as cattle or ships. Her worth was measured in dowry and bride price, and through her body, two families wove themselves into a stronger web of survival. The bride price, known as munda, was paid by the groom's family to the bride's kin. It was a mark of respect, proof that the union was honourable and the woman valued. The dowry, carried by the bride into her new household, balanced this payment. Keys to storerooms, bolts of cloth, livestock, and sometimes even land passed with her, ensuring that she entered marriage not empty-handed but as bearer of wealth. Together, these exchanges forged alliances more durable than words, for silver tarnishes slowly, but kinship lasts through generations. This marketplace of marriage was not hidden. It was spoken aloud at feasts, debated at the Thing, witnessed by kin and neighbours. A man who failed to offer a fair bride price risked mockery, his household branded as weak or dishonourable. A family that offered too little dowry risked seeing their daughter treated poorly, her voice diminished within the hall. Every negotiation revealed the standing of both families, and the outcome echoed long after the wedding feast. For women, marriage was both burden and power. Though they rarely chose their husbands outright, the wealth they carried granted them influence within their new home. A wife whose dowry was rich commanded respect, her keys rattling at her belt as she oversaw food, labour, and trade. Yet the knowledge that she was bartered like property lingered. Her body sealed the bargain, her fertility ensuring that the wealth exchanged bore fruit in the form of heirs. The sagas often frame these negotiations in stark terms. Kings and jarls offered their daughters to cement peace or secure warriors. Farmers sought alliances with wealthier neighbours to strengthen their households. In these stories, women are described as prizes, yet also as keystones. Without them, the structure of alliance collapsed. Some women resisted, using sharp wit or hidden bargains to shape their fates, but most walked the path laid out by kin, carrying dowries as silently as burdens. Archaeological finds echo these tales. Women's graves, filled with rich brooches, silver keys, and imported goods, speak of marriages that bound households into larger networks of trade and power. Such wealth reveals the stakes of the market. Marriage was not only a personal union, but a political act, visible in the very soil that holds their bones. Thus, the Viking marriage was more than a bed. Shared, it was a contract, a transaction, a marketplace where love was secondary to survival. In the clink of silver and the chime of keys, alliances were forged, households secured, and futures bargained. The market of marriage though wrapped in ritual, was at its heart a matter of coin, cattle, and kin. In the Viking hall, laughter was never harmless. Even jest, laced with mirth, could cut like a blade. Humour, like poetry, was a weapon, wielded as often to wound as to amuse. The sacred joke was one of the most dangerous forms of speech in the North, a jest that touched upon honour, sexuality, or fertility. Spoken at a feast, before kin and neighbours, it could strip a man bare, ruin a woman's standing, or ignite a feud that spilled into blood. The sagas preserve many such moments. Warriors who returned from raids found themselves mocked for faltering in bed, their vigour compared unfavourably to their courage with the sword. Women were likened to wandering cattle if accused of unfaithfulness, their virtue laughed away in a single line. A careless remark about a couple's childless state could draw laughter in the moment, but leave scars that lingered for years. The sacred joke was powerful precisely because it touched truths or fears that all recognised, yet none dared to voice directly. Feasts were fertile ground for such words. Mead loosened tongues, and the hall's smoky rafters rang with bold verses. A man might boast of his stamina, only to hear another reply with sly humour, suggesting his wife still lay awake at night. The laughter of the hall was a storm once unleashed, it could not be contained. To endure the sacred joke without response was dishonour. To answer with wit could restore balance, but often only steel could silence the insult fully. Women, too, became both targets and participants. A wife mocked for barrenness might rise with sharp tongue, turning the jest back on her accuser. Some sagas recall women who matched men in wit, their replies cutting through the hall like axes. Yet the danger for women was greater, for while men could answer with duel or blood, women's defences lay in words alone or in the strength of their kin. If her brothers sat silent, her reputation might crumble beneath laughter's weight. Law codes reveal the seriousness behind the humour. Certain jokes, especially those implying a man's passivity or a woman's adultery, were treated as slander. Such words could justify holmgang, the ritual duel, or heavy fines. In this way, the sacred joke was never only entertainment, it was trial, test, and often spark for violence. Archaeology cannot preserve laughter, but it shows its echoes. Amulets, charms, and carved runes of fertility found in households may have been both serious and humorous. Their dual meanings a reminder that even sacred things could be subjects of jest. The very gods themselves were not spared Loki. The trickster mocked gods and men alike, his jests tearing at truths that none wished spoken. Thus, the sacred joke held immense power. It bound communities through shared laughter, yet it also tore them apart when boundaries were crossed. In a world where honour was everything, to laugh was to judge, and to be laughed at was to bleed. The hall's firelight made every jest a trial, and in its glow humour became as sacred and as deadly as the sword. The wedding feast was filled with laughter, song, and the clatter of horns raised high, but all knew the true test lay after the embers dimmed. The bride and groom, bound by gifts of swords and keys, faced the long night that would decide whether their union was real. The first night together was not hidden away in privacy. It was a public matter cloaked only in pretense. Kinsmen, thralls, and neighbours lingered nearby, waiting for proof. It was called the Night of Trial, and its outcome carried weight heavier than any oath. The Longhouse did not sleep. Though cloaks were drawn and whispers hushed, ears remained sharp. The movement of blankets, the muffled words, even the rhythm of breath, all were signs to those who listened. In some places, servants inspected linens at dawn, searching for the crimson stain that marked consummation. In others, rumour alone was enough, for silence could be damning. A marriage unfulfilled brought suspicion. Was the groom weak, or the bride unwilling? Either way, the alliance trembled. For the husband, this night was a measure of manhood. To falter was to invite mockery that could echo for years, repeated at feasts, carved into verse, thrown back in duels of words or weapons. For the bride, it was proof of her purity, her body's value sealed by the act. If she resisted, the burden fell upon her shoulders, her loyalty questioned, her family dishonored. Both carried the weight of expectation, for their bodies were not their own, they were vessels of lineage and survival. The sagas carry echoes of such trials, tales of warriors mocked for failure, their brides leaving them in shame. Others tell of couples who proved themselves boldly, their unions celebrated as fertile and blessed. In these stories, the night was not about pleasure, but about duty, survival, and the unbroken chain of kin. Archaeology offers hints of ritual tied to these nights. Amulets of Thor's hammer hung above beds, small charms buried beneath floorboards, carved phalluses hidden near doorways. These were not decorations, they were blessings, meant to stir fertility and protect the couple from misfortune. Even the gods were invoked to witness the night of trial, for in its outcome lay the future of the household. For some, the night passed quietly, remembered only in whispers. For others, it ended in ruin, with accusations carried to the thing, alliances collapsing under the weight of rumour. The trial was not only between man and woman, but between two families, their honour tied to what unfolded beneath woolen cloaks. Thus, the night of trial was never truly private. It was a stage, lit by firelight, and judged by unseen eyes. Success brought respect, failure brought mockery, and both shaped the course of lives. In the Viking world, where every act carried consequence, even the wedding bed was an arena of honour, and the first night together a test as perilous as any battle fought beneath the open sky. In the Viking world, law and custom named many acts openly battle, theft, oath, and adultery. But there were certain intimacies left unspoken, hidden in half-lines of poetry and whispered in sagas. These were the forbidden touches, gestures that crossed invisible boundaries, feared not for their pleasure but for the shame they brought if revealed. To commit them was dangerous, to be accused of them was ruin. Their silence in the law books speaks as loudly as their presence in verse, for all knew of them, yet none dared name them fully. Masculinity in Norse society was bound to dominance. A man proved himself in the field, at the thing, and in the bed. To be accused of taking the passive role, whether true or not, was to be unmade. Such an accusation stripped him of his standing, mocked his manhood, and marked him forever as neithinger, a man without honour. Law codes even allowed duels or killings to silence such slander, so grievous was the insult. Yet beneath this surface of iron, stories linger of men and women who reached beyond the permitted, exploring what society forbade, even as they feared discovery. The sagas sometimes hint at these forbidden acts through mockery. Skalds wove double meanings into their verses, suggesting perversions without naming them outright. A man compared to a mare, a woman likened to wandering cattle, such imagery was never innocent. The laughter that followed carried a blade's edge, for all in the hall knew what was implied. These jokes were dangerous, and men often answered them not with words but with steel. For women, the forbidden touch carried different weight. To step beyond the boundaries of wifely duty, to seek pleasure outside what was expected, was to risk accusations of unfaithfulness. Yet sagas also tell of women who whispered their desires, who sought what their husbands could not give, finding fleeting freedom before returning to silence. Their danger lay not in dominance but in secrecy, for exposure meant ruin. Archaeology, too, whispers of this hidden world. Amulets and carvings of exaggerated shapes, found in both graves and households, suggest acts tied to fertility rites or private indulgence. Were these objects sacred, or were they hints of pleasures that could not be spoken aloud? The line between ritual and intimacy was thin, blurred by belief and necessity. The forbidden touch was not merely about flesh, it was about fear. Fear of dishonour, fear of exposure, fear of laughter that could destroy families and spark feuds. Yet it also revealed the unspoken truth, that desire did not always bend to law. Beneath the weight of custom, people reached for what lay beyond, knowing that if discovered, they would pay with their names, their honour, perhaps even their lives. Thus the forbidden touch remained a shadow in the Viking world, present, practiced, and feared. It lingered in silence, in whispers, in the half-light of the longhouse. Unnamed but always known, it was proof that even in a society ruled by law and honour, desire often crossed into places no one dared to admit aloud. In the smoky stillness of the longhouse, when the air was thick with pine resin and the rafters groaned beneath winter winds, there was no sound more powerful than the first cry of a newborn. That single voice, shrill and fragile, was the seal of survival. It carried the weight of alliances, the promise of future warriors, and the continuation of names whispered in sagas. In a world where every farmstead stood on the edge of hunger and every family on the edge of extinction, the heir's cry was more than a child's. It was the sound of victory. Midwives, women seasoned in the ways of birth, hovered over the mother with steady hands and whispered prayers. Herbs were burned, charms hung, and Thor's hammer amulets pressed near to guard against death. When at last the child emerged, the hall waited in breathless silence. If the child cried, relief spread like fire, laughter and weeping breaking the tension. Horns were raised, thanks given to gods and ancestors alike. If silence lingered, sorrow fell heavy, for the absence of that cry meant not only grief for a lost child, but the shattering of hopes for inheritance. The father's role began at that moment. He lifted the infant and sprinkled water over its head, a custom that bound the child into kinship, marking it as his own. Without this ritual of acceptance, the child's fate remained uncertain. A father could reject an infant, leaving it to die on the earth outside the hall. Though harsh, this act was not unknown, for a household too weak to feed another mouth sometimes chose survival over compassion. Yet most fathers embraced their heirs, for every child was a shield against the oblivion of a forgotten line. The heir's cry was not only the beginning of life, it was a statement of power. A son meant strength, another hand to wield sword or plough. A daughter meant alliances, her dowry and marriage, weaving kin into wider networks of survival. Both were precious, though differently valued, and both shaped the fortunes of the hall. A woman who bore many healthy children rose in respect, her fertility honoured as much as her husband's valour in battle. Sagas often recall the joy or tragedy of these births. Kings celebrated heirs born under auspicious signs, warriors swore oaths beside cradles, and families rejoiced when weak unions finally bore fruit. Yet they also record bitterness when children were born of concubines, their legitimacy contested, or when rivals accused one another of raising bastards in the guise of heirs. The cry of a child could bring peace, but it could also ignite feuds. Archaeology bears witness in small graves where tiny bones lie with amulets or beads, tokens of love even in loss. These burials remind us of the fragility of life and of how many cries were silenced too soon. Still, for those who survived, the heir's first cry echoed long beyond the night of their birth. It was the sound of hope, the breath of ancestors reborn, and the promise that the line would endure. In the Viking world, no sound was more sacred, no moment more binding. Words in the Viking hall could cut like steel, and sometimes they demanded steel in answer. When mockery struck too deep, especially in matters of intimacy, men turned to holmgang, the ritual duel fought to settle insults. These were not battles of armies, but of honour, staged on marked ground where reputation stood at stake. To be mocked as weak in the bed, accused of cowardice in love or marriage, was to be wounded in the soul. The jeering duel was the cure, though it often ended in blood. The holmgang carried strict rules. 2 men met upon an island or a circle marked with hazel stakes. Each brought witnesses, each bore weapons, and each swore that the outcome would decide the quarrel. It was not only strength that mattered, but skill, courage, and the gods' favour. The insult that had begun as laughter in the hall now sharpened into silence as kin and neighbours gathered to watch. A jest about another man's wife or his performance in bed became the spark for a fight that could end a life. The sagas record such duels in vivid detail. Warriors accused of perverse acts, mocked as unmanly, or slandered with rumours of adultery, often demanded satisfaction. To refuse a challenge was worse than death. It was to admit the insult true. Thus, even when the quarrel was born of drunken words, men answered with steel. Their blood upon the ground restored what laughter had stolen, though it left widows and orphans in its wake. Women, too, were drawn into these trials. A wife accused in jest might press her husband to defend her honour, for her own voice could not silence the insult. Her reputation depended upon his courage, and his failure would stain her as well. Thus, the jeering duel was not only about two men, but about entire households, their honour bound together on the marked field. Yet the duel was not always fatal. Sometimes a wound was enough, a cut across the cheek, a broken arm, proof that one man had stood firm while the other faltered. The onlookers judged the outcome, and peace was restored. But when death came, the matter did not always end. Kin of the slain might demand vengeance, turning a jest into a feud that spread across generations. Archaeological finds suggest that Holmgang was more than legend. Weapons buried with men of lower status, scars on bones, and references in law codes point to the ritual's reality. These duels were not mere stories, but part of life, as much a tool of justice as the thing itself. The jeering duel reveals how fragile honour was in the Viking world. A single laugh could unmake a man. A single verse could drive him to blood. Reputation was so precious that men risked death to preserve it. In the smoky longhouses, where jokes sharpened into insults, every word carried danger. And when laughter turned cruel, the only answer was the circle of hazel, the clash of steel, and the judgment of the gods. When a Viking woman died, the sound of her keys no longer rang against her belt, but often they followed her into the grave. Heavy iron keys, worn smooth by years of use, were placed upon her body as she was lowered into the earth. These were not trinkets, but symbols of her authority, tokens of the power she wielded within the household. In life, the chime of keys marked her as keeper of stores, guardian of wealth, and steward of survival. In death, they declared her role eternal, ensuring her memory endured as the heart of the home. The keys were more than tools. They were the measure of trust. A woman who bore them managed food, livestock, cloth, and servants. She controlled what went into mouths during lean winters, what cloth became trade or dowry, what wealth was guarded or shared. To take the keys from her belt was to strip her of authority. To bury them with her was to proclaim her sovereignty even beyond the grave. Archaeologists uncover these keys still, corroded but unmistakable, lying beside brooches and beads in women's graves across Scandinavia. The sagas speak of such women, sharp of tongue and strong of will. They are remembered not only as wives, but as rulers of their households, their counsel sought in matters of trade and kinship. Some stood beside their husbands at the thing, advising in whispers that carried as much weight as spoken law. Others guarded their households in their husbands' absence, ensuring farms did not falter while men sailed abroad. Their keys rattled like steel in scabbards, reminders that their power was both domestic and political. The burial of keys carried a deeper meaning still. In Viking belief, objects buried with the dead often served them in the afterlife. To give a woman her keys was to ensure she carried her authority into the halls beyond, where ancestors dwelled and feasts never ended. Even in death, she remained the keeper, the provider, the matriarch who held her kin together. Yet, not all women carried keys to their graves. Those without wealth or authority were buried with little, their silence in death echoing their silence in life. The presence or absence of keys reveals a stark truth. Power among women, as among men, was uneven. Some lived and died as shadows, while others rose to command respect that outlived them by centuries. Still, the image of the key-bearing woman lingers strongest. Her jingling steps through the smoky hall, her stern hand upon storeroom doors, her presence in council and feast, these defined her as surely as swords defined men. And when the earth closed over her, those same keys rested at her side, eternal markers of her strength. Thus, the Viking woman was not merely vessel or prize, she was steward, strategist, and survivor. The keys buried with her remind us that in the heart of every household she held power as vital as the sword, and that her authority was carried proudly, even into death. In a world where marriages were often forged as alliances between families, a Viking bride was expected to follow the path chosen for her. Yet the sagas tell of women who resisted, whose voices rang clear against the weight of custom. A bride could, in certain moments, refuse her union through clever words, through ritual protest, or through outright defiance. Her decision carried peril, but it also revealed the strength Viking women could wield when honor or desire demanded. The law gave women limited but real avenues of refusal. At the Thing, where disputes were aired, a maiden could argue against an unwanted match if she had not consented. More often, her refusal came at the hearth, where marriage was announced. If she declared publicly that she would not take the man, her voice could not be easily ignored, especially if her kin supported her. A father or brother might override her, but such defiance, spoken in front of witnesses, carried weight in a society that prized words as binding as oaths. The sagas preserve these moments vividly. Tales are told of women who scorned suitors with sharp wit, turning mockery into weapon. One maiden declared she would never marry a man who had fled from battle, shaming him before all. Another refused a wealthy farmer, saying she would not waste her youth beside a man with no courage. Such words cut deep, for rejection wounded honor more keenly than steel. Men mocked in this way often sought vengeance, but their shame was remembered long after the wound had healed. Sometimes refusal was quieter, hidden in cunning acts. A bride might weave a secret bargain with another suitor, ensuring her father's plans unravelled. Others used rituals of protest, standing silent at the doorway, refusing to share the bridal bed, or even declaring divorce the morning after consummation. These gestures shocked households, yet they were recognized by law, which gave women the power to dissolve marriages through public declaration at the bed, the hearth, and the doorway. Archaeology hints at the strength of these women. Graves of women buried with rich goods, brooches, beads, and keys suggest they retained authority in life, not as passive brides, but as women who shaped their own fates. Though many followed the paths chosen for them, some carved out new ones, remembered not for obedience but for defiance. The bride who refused was dangerous to the fragile balance of kinship. Her voice could unmake alliances, her choice could insult entire families. Yet she also embodied a truth the Vikings recognized, that strength lay not only in men's swords but in women's will. A household built on a woman's silence was brittle, a union forged with her defiance tempered into respect. Thus, the bride who refused stands as a figure both feared and admired. She broke expectation, spoke against the tide, and in doing so left a mark as lasting as any warrior's scar. Her refusal was not merely a personal act, it was a challenge to the order of kin and hall, a reminder that even in a world ruled by men, women's voices could change the course of fate. In the Viking world, age carried both loss and strength. The fires of youth dimmed, muscles withered, and the vigour that once fueled 3-hour unions or fearsome battles gave way to stiffness in the joints and slower breath. Yet, with these changes came a different kind of power. The elder, no longer driven by flesh or fury, wielded memory, wit, and the freedom of a tongue unchained by desire. In the Longhouse, where every act was witnessed and judged, the words of the old carried a weight sharpened by years. For men, the fading of virility was a double-edged fate. A warrior who once boasted of his prowess might now endure jokes whispered at feasts. His name, once tied to endurance and fertility, became the subject of laughter. Yet while his body faltered, his wisdom grew. Old men became keepers of memory, reciting sagas, recounting laws, reminding the young of oaths sworn and deeds long past. Their tongues, once cautious, could mock the youth in turn, dismissing their untested boasts with scorn. Though mocked for weakness, they often struck back with sharper ridicule, turning insult into a contest of wit rather than of flesh. Women, too, bore the burden of age. Their fertility spent, their authority shifted. A young wife's value was often tied to her womb, but an older woman, freed from that expectation, could speak more boldly. The sagas remember widows and mothers whose sharp tongues cut through gatherings, unafraid to shame men for cowardice or folly. These women, no longer burdened by the threat of childbearing, became advisors, matchmakers, and guardians of memory. Some ruled households as matriarchs, their keys still heavy at their belts, their authority unquestioned even when their bodies weakened. The hall reflected these transitions. Younger kin carried the weight of labour, but the elders carried the weight of counsel. Their stories, repeated in smoke-filled air, taught the young what honour demanded, what shame destroyed, and how to navigate the perilous balance of desire and duty. To ignore them was folly, for their memories stretched back to feuds, marriages, and betrayals that shaped the present. Still, the weight of old age was not always honoured. Some sagas speak of elders mocked too cruelly, dismissed as useless, their words drowned out by laughter. Such scorn reflected the fear of the young that they, too, would one day lose their strength, their standing. Yet even then, the old wielded a final weapon, prophecy. Their warnings, whether of war, betrayal, or famine, carried the chill of fate, for age brought not only memory, but a sense of the gods' whispers. Thus, the weight of old age in the Viking world was both burden and crown. It stripped the body, but it freed the tongue. It dimmed desire, but it sharpened wisdom. In the glow of the Longhouse hearth, elders sat as living sagas, reminding all that strength fades, but honour endures, and that the measure of a life was not only in passion or battle, but in the memory carried forward when both had passed. The Viking world was not sealed within its fjords and forests. Traders, raiders, and wanderers carried its people across seas, and in return, foreign travellers gazed back into their smoky halls. From these encounters came accounts that puzzled, shocked, or intrigued outsiders, especially in matters of intimacy. To Arab merchants, to Christian monks, to Frankish envoys, the habits of the north seemed wild, unrestrained, and strange. Their words, preserved in chronicles, reveal not only the Viking body but the lens of the stranger's eye. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, travelling among Norse traders along the Volga, recorded with fascination and disgust the ways of these seafaring men. He noted their ritual baths, where men and women washed together, splashing water over their naked forms without shame. To him, raised in a world of modesty, this was shocking, proof of barbarism. Yet to the Vikings, it was survival and custom, for cleanliness was tied to honour, and the mingling of bodies carried no sense of sin. Christian envoys, too, wrote of Viking ways with alarm. Monks, accustomed to vows of chastity, could scarcely comprehend feasts where wives, concubines, and servants shared space without rigid separation. The public nature of intimacy within the Longhouse seemed scandalous to their eyes. Where the Norse saw fertility and necessity, the Christians saw sin. Their reports shaped the way later generations judged the North, weaving images of excess and lust into the legend of the Viking age. Yet, Not all accounts were condemning. Some foreigners admired what they saw. Frankish merchants remarked upon the beauty of Viking women, their braided hair and bright garments, their freedom to laugh and speak at feasts. Others noted the boldness of Norse men, unashamed in their talk of desire, unafraid to weave sexuality into verse. To those from lands where silence and modesty were demanded, the Vikings appeared freer, though dangerous in their liberty. The sagas themselves occasionally echo these foreign observations, though from the opposite side. Norse storytellers mocked Christian notions of sin, portraying priests as timid and foolish. To them, the stranger's eye was not a mirror but a jest, proof that outsiders could not understand the ways of the North. Where foreigners saw shame, the Vikings saw strength. Where they saw excess, the Vikings saw survival. Archaeology bridges these perspectives. Graves filled with combs, beads, and bathing tools suggest a people deeply concerned with appearance and hygiene. Artifacts of fertility rituals, from phallic carvings to amulets, reveal beliefs outsiders would find strange. Yet for the Vikings, these were threads in the fabric of life, woven without secrecy or apology. The stranger's eye reminds us that the Viking world was never isolated. It was seen, judged, and remembered by those who passed through its halls. Their writings preserved echoes of laughter, ritual, and desire, distorted, perhaps, but invaluable glimpses nonetheless. In those gazes, we see not only the Vikings, but the deep gulf between cultures, where what was sacred to one seemed scandalous to another. And in that gulf lies the tension that gave birth to legend. When the cross first entered the North, it did not arrive as a sudden storm, but as a whisper, carried on the breath of monks, merchants, and envoys. At first, it was a symbol mocked at feasts, its fragile figure compared to the strength of Thor's hammer. Yet, slowly, through trade, alliances, and conversion by kings, the whisper of Christianity began to reshape how intimacy was seen. Where once fertility was celebrated openly and laughter rang in the hall at bawdy verse, the new faith spoke of sin, chastity, and guilt. The shift was quiet but profound. Christian missionaries were shocked by the openness of Viking life. They wrote of longhouses where men and women shared space without shame, where couples embraced beneath cloaks while others lay only an arm's length away. To these missionaries, such acts were evidence of godlessness, proof that the North needed saving. Their sermons condemned what had long been custom divorce, concubinage, fertility rites, even the skaldic poems that praised desire. Slowly, these condemnations began to take root, not because they were believed, but because power demanded it. Kings who converted for political advantage brought the church's laws into their lands. Marriage became less a contract of kin and more a sacrament of the church. Divorce, once spoken by a wife at the bed or the doorway, was now forbidden. Adultery, once punished with blood or fines, was recast as sin against God rather than dishonor against kin. Slowly, the language of survival gave way to the language of shame. Yet resistance lingered. Many still wore Thor's hammer amulets, even as they carved crosses into their doorposts. Women clung to their rights of divorce long after priests condemned them, and fertility charms continued to be buried beneath beds. In this twilight of belief, both old and new ways coexisted uneasily. A man might attend Mass in the morning and join in a fertility feast at night, his loyalties divided between Christ and the old gods. The sagas reflect this tension. Some portray Christians as timid, mocked for their modesty. Others show Norse chieftains adopting the new ways while still honouring the old. The whisper of Christianity was not yet a roar, but its presence was undeniable. It shifted how people thought of their bodies, their unions, and their desires. What was once celebrated as natural became shadowed with suspicion. Archaeological finds mirror this change. Burial sites, once filled with hammers, beads, and fertility amulets, began to include crosses and church goods. The dead carried both sets of symbols, as though unwilling to choose fully between the two worlds. Thus, the whisper of Christianity did not erase the old ways in a single breath. It lingered, spreading like frost over the land, reshaping intimacy into something to be judged by priests rather than kin. Yet even as it grew, the memory of the old ways endured, clinging to longhouses, sagas, and the silent gaze of ancestors who once saw no sin in desire, only survival. Long after the cross had spread through the fjords and churches rose where groves once stood, echoes of the old ways lingered. The half-remembered rites of fertility and intimacy clung to Viking households like smoke in the rafters, stubborn and unyielding. Though priests thundered against them, though written law condemned them, the people held fast to customs that had once bound them to the gods of their ancestors. These rites did not vanish, they changed, hidden in shadows, softened into whispers, surviving as fragments in memory. In some homes, amulets shaped like Thor's hammer were still hung above marriage beds, though now placed discreetly beneath crosses. Mothers slipped phallic charms into the bedding of their daughters, invoking strength and fertility as they had for generations. The church called such things superstition, yet the people called them necessity. A woman who had seen 3 winters pass without children would still turn to these charms, believing them to stir the womb when prayers alone failed. Rituals tied to the earth, too, endured. Farmers continued to bless their fields with carved tokens of fertility, burying small wooden figures beneath the soil before planting. These acts were framed as tradition rather than faith, yet their roots reached back to Freya, god of abundance. To outsiders, they were harmless customs. To those who practiced them, they were lifelines, ensuring that crops would rise and children would grow. The sagas recall this twilight of belief with ambivalence. Some heroes mocked the old rites, scorning them as relics of heathen days. Others clung to them, weaving them into stories where gods still walked unseen. In these tales, the gods did not vanish. They retreated, hidden behind the veil of the new faith, waiting for those bold enough to remember. Women were often the keepers of these half-remembered rites. While priests preached from pulpits, wives and mothers passed down charms and prayers at the hearth. They whispered incantations while weaving, buried protective herbs beneath thresholds, and tied knots into cords to guard against infertility. These acts, small and quiet, resisted the erasure of memory. For them, survival mattered more than doctrine, and if old customs offered hope, they endured. Archaeology confirms their persistence. Beneath church floors and Christian graves, scholars have unearthed fertility amulets, phallic carvings, and hidden charms. They reveal a people who did not abandon their gods all at once, but carried fragments of belief into new lives. The rites became softer, subtler, but they never truly died. The half-remembered rites remind us that culture does not vanish in a single generation. Even as Christianity reshaped law and custom, the old ways lingered, stitched into daily life. In quiet gestures, in hidden charms, in whispered prayers, the Vikings carried their ancestors' beliefs into a new age. Though the names of gods faded, their presence lived on in memory, half remembered yet never forgotten, etched into the rhythm of life as surely as the tides upon their northern shores. As the new faith spread deeper into the north, and the old gods receded into half-whispered tales, silence grew heavy in the longhouses. What had once been spoken openly, jest at feasts, verses sung with daring, the bold talk of fertility and strength, became hushed, restrained, swallowed in the throat. The shadow of silence fell across intimacy, shaping lives as powerfully as laughter and law once had. Desire did not vanish, but its expression retreated, hidden behind closed lips and guarded glances. In the age before, a man mocked for weakness in the bed might answer with sharp verse or duel. A wife mocked for barrenness could rely on kin to defend her standing. Now, as Christianity's grip tightened, even to speak of such matters was perilous. The priests preached that silence was virtue, that modesty was holy, that to discuss the body was to walk the edge of sin. Yet, in the Longhouse, where generations still remembered the open customs of old, this forced quiet bred unease. The sagas hint at this transformation. Earlier tales overflow with crude jest and frank speech, but later ones soften, cloaking desire in allegory. Where once poets named the act with bold kennings, they now masked it in riddles or avoided it altogether. This literary silence mirrored the halls themselves, where words that had once rung freely now died unspoken in the smoky air. To laugh too loudly at a bawdy joke risked being branded ungodly. To mock another's intimacy risked not only feud but damnation. For women, the shadow of silence was both shield and chain. In the old world, a wife could declare divorce openly at the bed, the hearth, or the doorway, her voice heard by kin and neighbours. Under the new faith, her voice was quieted, her rights curtailed. Intimacy became cloaked not only in silence but in shame, her desires unspoken, her body now bound not just to husband and kin, but to church law. Yet silence also gave her cover. In quiet, she could still pass down charms, whispering to daughters what she dared not speak aloud in public. The rituals lived on, but in secrecy, softened into superstition rather than sacred rite. Men too bore this burden. The warrior once measured by his vigour as well as his sword now faced a new expectation that desire itself be restrained. Boasting of conquests once celebrated became frowned upon. What was once honour risked being recast as sin. Some resisted, holding fast to old customs, but others bowed beneath the growing weight of silence, unsure how to reconcile survival with salvation. Archaeology whispers of this shift. Amulets and charms of fertility still appear in Christian-era graves, but hidden beneath crosses, tucked away where they would not draw censure. The silence did not erase the old ways, it merely buried them deeper in earth and memory. The shadow of silence was more than absence of sound. It was a new presence, a force shaping behaviour as surely as law or laughter. In that silence, the old world lingered, muffled but alive, waiting in the unspoken spaces between prayer and hearth. As the centuries turned and the cross stood taller than Thor's hammer, the old longhouses began to fall quiet. Where once their rafters echoed with song, jest, and whispered unions, silence spread like a frost across the north. Christianity did not tear them down at once. Timber rotted, roofs sagged, and families drifted into smaller homes, but the change was deeper than wood and stone. With the longhouses faded a way of life, and with it the sounds of intimacy lived in community, unhidden, unashamed. In the old days, a child's cry, a wife's sigh, a husband's boast, all mingled under one smoky roof. Privacy was unknown, and so intimacy was shared not by choice, but by survival. These walls remembered everything. They bore witness to the 3-hour trials of men, to concubines brought from far shores, to the jealous anger of wives, to the cruel silence of enslaved bodies. The hearth glowed upon laughter and shame alike, and in its firelight every act carried consequence. But now, as churches rose beside fjords and priests preached of sin, the great communal halls gave way to smaller, quieter homes. Secrets could be hidden at last, but something was lost in that silence. The sagas record the last glimmers of this fading world. They speak of feasts where scolds still risked their tongues, where women still rattled keys at their belts, where widows still spoke with sharp authority. Yet even in those tales, the Longhouse stands as memory more than present, its walls already shadowed by the new faith. The laughter of sacred jokes, the jewels born of mockery, the fertility rites once performed boldly, all are recalled with nostalgia, or with unease, as if belonging to another age entirely. Archaeology confirms the shift. Great halls once raised in timber and turf gave way to smaller farmsteads, their spaces divided, their sounds contained. Crosses carved into stone replaced the hammer amulets once buried beneath beds. Yet, in corners of graves, hidden among beads and brooches, lie the old charms, still tiny phalluses, hammer pendants, fertility figures, tokens of a memory too stubborn to die. The last longhouses may have fallen, but the people who left them carried fragments of their world into the new one. For those who lived through this change, the experience must have been heavy. The hearth that once united kin now stood alone, its circle smaller, its fire dimmer. The old gods lingered in stories, their laughter and shape-shifting desires still whispered at night, but no longer invoked at feasts. Sexuality, once communal, judged by laughter and law, became something hidden, weighed down with guilt. Yet in the hearts of those who remembered, the echoes of the longhouse never fully faded. Thus the last longhouse marks the end of an age. Its timbers rotted, but its memory endured in sagas, in songs, and in the soil itself. The Vikings had lived openly, bound by honour, laughter, and fertility, and though the cross silenced their halls, the truth of their lives remained. Even now, in the silence of the north, those echoes still breathe the moans, the whispers, the laughter of a world that once knew no walls between desire and survival.